Freyr, in my experience, is one of the least talked about of the deities central to heathenry, and I guess that makes some sense. In researching him, I've found that he can be a hard deity to discuss, which I guess is par for the course for a masculine fertility deity. Long ago, the gods made war against each other. The Aesir, gods associated with order, wisdom, and justice, fought to a standstill with the mysterious Vanir, gods of wealth, magic, and nature. The Vanir were known to have mysterious powers. They were gods that could stand against the Aesir, and it is recorded that they devastated one another's lands and did great damage to one another, but neither could gain the upper hand. Eventually, the leaders of the Aesir and Vanir came to the conclusion together that this war would go on forever, and that neither would ever win. The gods met in a place of what is considered grith, a temporary peace between them, in order to establish frith, a relationship of friendship and peace. During this process, hostages were exchanged in good faith to live amongst one another. This would generate an understanding between the two and build a stronger relationship between the gods. The Vanir gave 3 hostages to the Aesir to be considered Aesir from then on out. These 3 were Njorthr, god of ships and wealth from trade; Freyja, a fertility goddess associated with war, magic, and strangely enough, cats; and then finally Freyr, a fertility god associated with wealth, sunlight, and rainfall. Snorri records that the Aesir appointed these new deities among them in places of great leadership, while the Vanir found weaknesses in the Aesir that came to live with them and executed them. It seems, however, that this did not give cause for another war, because after this we do not hear of the Vanir in subsequent legends, except about those who came to live with the Aesir. Among them, a deity we're going to discuss today, Yngvi Freyr, most noted as the god of kings. Even his name, Freyr, simply means Lord. The origins of Freyr are contradictory, though we do seem to have some motivations behind the differences. The most detailed account of the Aesir-Vanir War is recorded by Snorri in the Heimskringla, in which he records Odin, Njorthr, and Freyr as human kings, though Snorri notes that they were seen as gods. In this story, Njorthr and Freyr are directly stated as part of the hostage exchange, and later it is suggested that Freyja was part of this process, and perhaps Njorthr's sister wife, though Snorri notes that brother-sister unions were not permitted among the Aesir. While Snorri seems to record this as the case, in the Prose Edda he records Freyr as being born after the hostage exchange, seemingly in a union between Njorthr and Skati. Still further, this account of Freyr is as a deity, whereas the former account is him as a human in a pseudo-historical account of an ancient Scandinavian society in which Freyr is one of the successors of a kingdom started by Odin. Whatever the case, the association between Freyr and kings is clear. Swedish kings often claimed lineage to Yngvi Freyr in a line known as the Ynglings. In the Heimskringla, it is recorded that Freyr's reign was one of great prosperity, apparently due to his mastery over seasons. And this lines up well with other accounts of Freyr's domain as a deity of rainfall and sunshine, with which comes good crops, and from those crops comes wealth, trade, and tribute. Freyr is also credited with the founding of the great temple at Uppsala, where he made his residence, and that regular sacrifices there were made in his name. And he also put his wealth and tribute from surrounding kingdoms toward the temple, which became associated with the crown of Sweden, solidifying Freyr's association with the lineage of kings. Something to note here is that the pattern of reframing the gods as men is a common motif among Christian record keepers discussing the gods. We see Snorri doing this regularly, and here is no exception. And even elsewhere, he discusses Freyr as a deity. Saxo Grammaticus also mentions the gods as men, even taking time to make fun of pagans who saw them as gods, even though it seems that Odin makes appearances in Saxo's records that are generations apart. And yet Saxo dismisses him as simply like this powerful wizard who is worshipped as a god by silly pagans. So in keeping with this, Freyr in this story does seem to fade back and forth from being seen as a deity and as a human king. The Heimskringla seems to hold that Odin, Njorthr, Freyr, and Freyja were all of some extraordinary nature, but it does seem committed to reframing them as people overseeing a kingdom. Even the Vanir and Aesir are described as two kingdoms at war and reframed as a human conflict, whereas elsewhere it's noted that these are distinct clans of deities. Unfortunately, with this process, we lose clarity about that divine image and understanding of Freyr. But what we have is what we have, and so much of Freyr as a god of kings is formatted as a man who was king and ascended to godhood. Whether or not Freyr was at one point a man is unknown. There are historical arguments for both images of Freyr, that he was a man who was later seen as a god, or that he was a god who might have been claimed as a name for a handful of kings so that they might inherit his legacy of wealth through mastery of seasons and good crops, and therefore be good kings for their people. Which brings us to Freyr's association with death. In the story of Freyr as a human king, as told by Snorri in the Heimskringla, Yngvi Freyr enjoys a long and fruitful reign. One of the many kennings describes him specifically as Lord Yngvi the Fruitful, again seemingly due to his mastery of seasons, sunlight, rainfall, allowing for bountiful harvest year after year, though in Snorri's telling, Freyr, being a human, falls sick and dies. Freyr's followers, as Snorri tells, kept this a secret and preserved his body as best they could. They carried his body into a burial mound and informed everyone that he was still alive. Offerings would be made to the burial mound itself, as Freyr ruled even in death, with a fruitful reign for 3 years. When it became common knowledge that he was dead, and yet still reigned with this fruitful mastery over the seasons, Snorri recounts that it was believed that this would continue for as long as Freyr remained in Sweden, so therefore his body was not to be burned on a pyre as was custom, but kept in the burial mound. Whether or not this story is the truth of Freyr's worship is unknown, but this story does associate Freyr with the burial mound, and how a lasting legacy can continue even in death. And across history, we see examples of how the burials of kings and influential people can be a source of luck for the place in which they are buried. And further, there is a ebb and flow between funerary practices among Germanic cultures, between pyres and burials, or some combination that includes the burying of ashes. But whatever the case, the legends do tell us of the personality of Freyr, that it is he who has mastery over the seasons, who brings rain and sunlight, giving fertility to his crops, and, as any good king should, ensures prosperity and peace within his realm, and informs us that it should be noted that a leader's legacy lasts longer than his life. Whereas many Norse gods double as war gods, Freyr is an exception. He stands as a peace deity that will come down with a force if that peace is disturbed. And we even see that the shedding of blood is offensive to him. In Viga-Glum's saga, a man named Glum offends Freyr by shedding blood on a field sacred to Freyr. And he offends him further by hiding an outlaw within his sacred territory, and then still further by swearing an ambiguous oath within his temple. By seeing that these things anger Freyr, we can also see what he stands for. Freyr's lands are to be ones of peace. He stands in respect for law and justice, and he demands that your oaths be clear in their intention and purpose. None of this ambiguous, unclear bullshit that is technically something, whatever. Be clear and realistic with your oaths. And do not make one that is lofty and unrealistic, nor should you make one that is so vague that you can uphold it by simply doing nothing. We see in the Norse pantheon a controversy of the high god. For some, it is very readily Odin, and this bears out in the texts. For others, it is Tyr, and we see linguistic evidence in the appearance from other traditions that it was once the case that Tyr, the sky god of justice and law, was once the high god. But for the Swedes, it appears that Lord Yngvi Freyr, the Fruitful, master of seasons, rainfall, and sunlight, was the high god among them. One of his kennings is world god, suggesting a more central point of leadership in the Swedish perspective of the pantheon. We see evidence of this through the veneration of Freyr in place names across Sweden, and the cult of Freyr seems to have traveled wide, and even though his appearance in traditions beyond Sweden was not always as the high god, his place as the god of kings seems readily apparent. And it's important to point out that the Norse narrative of Freyr as an immigrant god among the Aesir, and yet still the god of kings and fertility, also informs against some narratives that folkish heathens like to put forward about ridiculous notions of ethnocentrism in the religion. Given that Lord Yngvi Freyr has mastery over the seasons in forming agriculture, it follows that he would have this strong association with fertility. The lands devoted to his temples were the most fertile, made more so by the rain and sun through the seasons leading up to the harvest. And Freyr's fostering of this constant cycle between fertility and wealth translated into practices associated with his fertility and masculinity. This is one of the arguments that leads to the possibility of the concept of Freyr's association with rituals such as the one described in the strange story of the Volsi. I won't go into that here, go watch the video. The other, that Freyr seems to have a strong association with horses. In fact, it seems that Freyr may have inherited practice associated with a deity that may have been his mother, Nerthus, as described by Tacitus of Rome in Germania. Both are fertility deities that were carried by wagon from town to town. Both appear to have banished weapons from their presence in ritual. Both appear to have had a symbolic marriage to a priest or priestess as part of this ritual. In fact, there's a story of Freyr's anger becoming manifest against a Christian who wished to defile this marriage during the Christianization period. And it can be important to note that this story comes from the perspective of a Christian, and we don't know what story it might have been based on. But there was a Christian who quarreled with the king of Norway, and then he fled to Sweden, where Freyr is held in great honor. And there he found a temple to Freyr, where he became enamored with a priestess of the temple. When it came time for Freyr to make this traditional journey to bless the seasons, the Christian was invited along, though the priestess felt that it might not be the best idea to have him along, but this protest seems to have been ignored, and the idol was placed on a wagon with the priestess, and they headed out on their journey. Freyr seems to have responded to this with a blizzard instead of good weather, and the attendants to the wagon slowly abandoned the journey with the exception of the Christian. Apparently, the story goes that the Christian took a moment to rest, and the priestess warned him not to, or else Freyr would be angered, seeming to suggest that Freyr was fine with the Christian as long as he was helping. But if he stopped, his wrath would be upon them. As if the blizzard wasn't enough, at this moment, the idol itself stood up, possessed by Freyr, and came down to fight the Christian. And the struggle was fierce, but goes the way of the Christian, who destroys the idol. Now, what follows this is a parody involving the Christian dressing up as Freyr as they continue their journey and accruing wealth for themselves as they fool the silly pagans into giving them money because, well, he's Freyr. As with the Volsi, which is probably the strangest video I've ever made, from the parody, we can glean a little into the reality of the practice, that there seemed to be a symbolic marriage between Freyr and his priestesses, and that there was a practice of taking Freyr by wagon to the various towns to bless the seasons and fertile lands to beget wealth, and from the fighting idol, we can learn that the bond between Freyr and his priestesses was particularly sacred, and that trifling with this bond would anger him. But this story makes a mockery of that, and in making a mockery of it, it tells us of its importance. There's only one major Eddic story featuring Freyr as the central character, and he doesn't really contribute much to the narrative other than kind of being there. Unfortunately, considering the importance of Freyr, it's likely that there were many stories of Freyr that are just lost to time, and the same can be said of many gods, such as Tyr. The story is, largely, that he sees a Jotun woman from Odin's high seat, suggesting that Freyr had a place of leadership even in Asgard. Apparently, Freyr is a bit of an arm man. He sees shimmering light from the arms of a Jotun named Gerdr, and he decides that he must marry her immediately. So he sends a messenger to broker for the marriage. And there's conflicting narratives around it, but the narratives do agree that Freyr gives his sword to the messenger in payment for the journey into Jotunheim. Now, Freyr's sword is described as shimmering with sunlight and has the ability to fight on its own, provided that the wielder knows how to use its power. Freyr giving up his sword for marriage, however, has dire consequences. This leads to an example of one of the many lost stories of Freyr, as Snorri records one of the consequences of Freyr going swordless for marriage. Now, the story itself is lost, but Snorri references Freyr resorting to killing a Jotun named Beli with a stag's horn as an improvised weapon, though it's simply mentioned offhand, and we have no idea about the conditions surrounding why exactly this took place. Another lost story with Freyr is how he became associated with Alfheim. It's suggested that he was given dominion over the land of the elves and this understanding of them as beings of shimmering light. And this follows due to Freyr's association with sunlight, but The story of how it came to be is lost. In a passage bringing up the association, it is said that it was given to him as a tooth gift, which is to say that the realm was given to him as a child, but this would presumably predate the Aesir The Vanir war, so there's some uncertainty here, and the Alfar are not associated with Freyr in any other stories that we have. There is also the association between Freyr and the boar, which shows up as the sacred symbol of Sweden, as well as many other cultures, including the Gauls who fought against Rome. The boar was associated with fertility and strength, and in the Eddas we see that Freyr is granted a mount by the dwarves Eitri and Brokr, in the form of a golden boar named Gullinbursti, whose golden bristles light the way wherever he may go. This association with the boar comes up again in the Saga of Hrolf Kraki. The saga's villain is a Freyr worshipper, King Adolf of Sweden, and he is said to give sacrifice to a mighty troll in the castle which takes the form of a boar. When the struggle between Hrolf Kraki and his champions against King Adolf goes sour, the king unleashes the monstrous boar to fight them. And one of King Hrolf Kraki's greatest champions, the son of a werebear, Bodvar Bjarki, fights the boar with the aid of Hrolf Kraki's vicious dog Gram. Though Bodvar Bjarki, despite his reputed strength, was unable to damage the boar, Gram was able to leap on top of its head and rip off its ears, tearing off the boar's cheeks in the process, and this caused the boar to retreat further into the castle, abandoning King Adolf to the heroes as they continued their quest. Freyr's lost sword comes to a head during Ragnarok. For whatever reason, even though he's a central deity, getting a replacement sword was not among his abilities. This may, in fact, have something to do with his place in the pantheon as a peace god, that he gave up his weapon for marriage and then remained without one thereafter, when combined with the offense that he has to weapons in his temples and rituals, suggests that remaining without a sword may well have been purposeful. But Freyr, even without a weapon, is still not a god to be trifled with. As we mentioned before, Freyr still kills the Jotun Bailey with a stag's antler. So even though he is a god of peace, this does not mean he is committed to non-violence, nor does it mean that without a weapon he is defenseless. In fact, he seems quite formidable. But it seems that Freyr's sword was a weapon that was on par with Mjolnir in many ways, the hammer that's associated with lightning that returns to Thor's hands when thrown. Freyr's sword, shimmering in sunlight, was able to fight on its own with the skill of the wielder in consideration. So obtaining a replacement could prove difficult, if not impossible. And yet, this sword might show up again in the legends, as in the Völuspá it is mentioned that Surtr goes against Freyr carrying with him a mighty sword shimmering with the sunlight of the battle gods, and that Freyr will lose this exchange and fall because he does not have a good sword. Now, there is no story about how Skirnir, the messenger who Freyr gave his sword, may have lost that sword, but it is possible that Surtr's sword, shimmering in sunlight, may be the same sword that somehow wound up in his hands. Perhaps there's a missing legend somewhere where Skirnir loses the sword to Surtr, spelling doom for Freyr at Ragnarok. Freyr is definitely a strange god, in that he seems to be largely forgotten in popular heathen culture, and yet, when you take a look at his legacy and history, and the stories around him, we actually seem to know quite a bit about him, such that he shouldn't be this deity that seems to have a presence in modern heathenry that is almost like, oh yeah, Freyr. He's a complex deity, and he falls into multiple categories. He is Aesir, he is Vanir, he is a venerated ancestor, a god of kings, peace, fertility, and wealth, all of which are important elements that should be more central to the modern practice of our religion. And honestly, his place as an immigrant to the Aesir, and a god of kings and fertility among them, is an excellent middle finger to the focus within heathenry. And with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. Make a fertility phallus out of the subscribe button, seems reasonable, and don't offend the bell, lest he stand up and fight you in a blizzard. And remember to find a way or make one. So can we talk about this idol for a second? Like, that is just a gigantic